Millionaire catches a maid teaching his autistic son to do the impossible that doctors denied. For years he believed the cold reports and diagnoses claiming the boy would never speak. But one unexpected night, he saw his son singing, smiling, and learning, guided by someone no one ever valued. What seemed like a simple act of affection turns into a shocking revelation that could destroy reputations and save lives. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Now, on with the story. The March rain fell lightly over Park Avenue in Manhattan as Robert Miller watched from the window of his 23rd floor office. At 42, he helmed one of the country's largest financial technology companies, but his tired gaze betrayed a man who was winning corporate battles while losing other, more important ones at home. 3 years had passed since Marina, his wife, had decided to leave. There were no formal goodbyes, just a letter left on the bed, explaining that she could no longer bear the weight of a motherhood that suffocated her, a marriage that imprisoned her, a life she hadn't truly chosen. She simply vanished on a winter morning, leaving behind a stunned husband and a 2-year-old son, Gabriel, who was just beginning to form his first words. What Robert hadn't expected was that her abrupt departure would mark only the beginning of an even more painful journey. A few weeks later, while dealing with lawyers and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, he noticed that Gabriel had regressed. The boy, who had been babbling dada and water, returned to silence. His eyes, once curious, now seemed disconnected from the world around him. His tantrums intensified, his movements became repetitive, and any change in routine would trigger inconsolable crying fits. It was the pediatrician who first suggested a neurological evaluation. Robert still remembered the afternoon he received the diagnosis: autism spectrum disorder, level 3, requiring substantial support. The doctor's words echoed in his mind for days. Your son will need intensive intervention. The sooner we start, the greater the chances of progress. Driven by the desperation to do something, anything that could help, Robert threw himself into the search for the best available treatment. That was when he met Dr. Julia Foster, a renowned pediatric neurologist with international training and a private clinic on the Upper East Side, who promised revolutionary results in treating neurodivergent children. Julia was 40, with dark hair always tied in an impeccable bun, piercing green eyes, and a posture that radiated authority. Her office was all white and chrome, with framed diplomas covering an entire wall. She spoke with confidence about clinical protocols, neurotransmitters, brain plasticity, and cutting-edge therapies. To Robert, desperate and lost, her words sounded like the promise of salvation. "Mr. Miller," she had said during the first consultation, leafing through Gabriel's test results with a grave expression, "Your son presents a challenging case, but I have an intensive therapeutic program that has shown remarkable results. It will require discipline, investment, and, above all, trust in the process." Robert signed all the documents, authorized all the procedures, and hired the team of professionals recommended by Julia. In a few months, Gabriel's routine transformed into an endless series of sessions: occupational therapy, speech therapy, behavioral psychology, music therapy. The house, a spacious brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, was adapted to accommodate the professionals. One of the second-floor suites became a therapy room, equipped with educational materials, mirrors, and sensory equipment. But Robert was rarely present to witness these sessions. Immersed in work as a way to avoid confronting the pain he carried, he woke before dawn and returned when Gabriel was already asleep. On weekends, he would lock himself in his home office, reviewing contracts and strategic plans. The distance he kept from his son wasn't conscious, but necessary for his own emotional survival. To see Gabriel was to see Marina. It was to see what he had lost. It was to see his own inability to fix what was broken. Over time, Robert and Julia developed a relationship that transcended the professional. Dinners to discuss Gabriel's case became frequent meetings. She visited him at home under the pretext of evaluating the therapeutic environment. There was a chemistry between them, an attraction born from his vulnerability and her apparent competence. Julia presented herself as the only person who truly understood his situation, who didn't judge him for his absence, who offered not only hope for Gabriel but also comfort for him. "You're doing the best you can. Robert," she would often say, touching his arm with calculated familiarity, "Gabriel is receiving the most advanced care available. Time will show the results." But the results didn't appear. On the contrary, Gabriel seemed increasingly apathetic. During the rare occasions when Robert saw him awake, the boy was always drowsy, with a glazed look in his eyes and slow movements. The therapists reported resistance to stimuli and the need for medication adjustments. Julia increased dosages, introduced new drugs, always with technical explanations that Robert, in his medical ignorance, accepted without question. It was against this backdrop of mechanical routine and emotional absence that Rosemary Clark entered the Miller family's life. Rosemary was 53, with graying hair she always kept tied back, hands calloused from work, and a discreet smile that lit up her warm face. She had been hired 6 months ago through a cleaning agency to keep the house in order. She arrived at 7 in the morning and left at 5 in the afternoon, Monday through Saturday, moving through the house like a silent shadow, almost invisible to her employers and the medical team. But Rosemary was not just a cleaning lady. 30 years ago, she had been an elementary school teacher in a public school in an underserved neighborhood of New York City. She had taught hundreds of children to read, to write, to dream. But life, with its cruel twists, had led her down paths she never imagined. A difficult divorce, the need to support 2 children alone, the lack of opportunities for an aging woman in the job market. Her teaching certificates, tucked away in a drawer, were just reminders of a distant past. Now, her job was to wipe floors, dust surfaces, and organize spaces for people who barely noticed her presence. But Rosemary noticed everything, especially Gabriel. In the first few weeks, she just observed from a distance while cleaning the hallways. She saw the boy sitting in the therapy room, surrounded by toys he didn't touch, professionals who spoke to him in mechanical tones, following scripts and protocols. Gabriel was 5 now, with light brown hair and deep blue eyes that rarely focused on anything. He always wore soft, tagless clothes, because any different texture caused him discomfort. What caught Rosemary's attention was one Thursday afternoon, as she was cleaning the hallway near the therapy room. The door was ajar, and she could hear the session. The occupational therapist was trying to get Gabriel to fit colored blocks into corresponding shapes, but the boy remained inert, staring into space. Frustrated, the professional sighed and picked up her phone, typing something quickly while Gabriel was left alone at the table. It was then that Rosemary saw something that made her stop. Gabriel, thinking he was alone, reached out and picked up one of the red blocks. He didn't fit it into the shape, but held it up to the light, turning it slowly, watching how the sun coming through the window created patterns of shadow. His eyes were focused, interested, alive. When the therapist turned her attention back to him, Gabriel immediately dropped the block and returned to his apathetic posture. Rosemary felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that behavior. She had seen it before in her years of teaching. Children who learn to shut down, to make themselves invisible, to not react as a form of protection. Gabriel wasn't absent, he was hidden. In the following days, Rosemary began to observe more closely, always discreetly, always invisibly. She noticed that Gabriel reacted to certain sounds, especially music. When she turned on the vacuum cleaner in a certain rhythm, the boy would lightly tap his foot. When the grandfather clock in the living room chimed the hour, he would tilt his head, listening to the chimes. One afternoon, while cleaning the living room, Rosemary was quietly humming an old nursery rhyme she used to sing to her classes. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are." She didn't even realize Gabriel was on the sofa, supposedly resting between sessions. That's when she heard it, almost inaudible. "Star." Rosemary froze. She turned around slowly. Gabriel was looking at her, really looking, with an expression that seemed to say, "Keep going." Up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. Rosemary continued softly, approaching slowly. "Sky, sky," Gabriel repeated, his eyes shining with something Rosemary hadn't seen since she arrived at the house. genuine interest. In that moment, Rosemary made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't just pretend she hadn't seen it. She couldn't continue wiping floors while that boy withered away in a routine that clearly wasn't reaching him. But there was a huge problem. Rosemary was not a therapist, not a doctor, not authorized to interact with Gabriel beyond her cleaning duties. If anyone found out, she would be fired immediately. And worse, she could be accused of interfering with a child's treatment. Still, in the following days, Rosemary began to test the boundaries. When she was alone with Gabriel, even for a few minutes, she would sing, show him colorful objects, tell simple stories. And Gabriel responded. Not always, not dramatically, but he responded. A smile here, a glance there, whispered words, attempts at imitation. Rosemary started carrying a small notebook in her purse, where she jotted down her observations. March 15th. Gabriel repeated 3 words from the song, maintained eye contact for almost 20 seconds. March 18th. Showed him colored numbers. He correctly pointed to 3 and 7 when I asked. It was a dangerous secret she carried. But Rosemary felt, with every fiber of her being, that she was doing the right thing. Gabriel was not a lost cause. He was just trapped inside a system that didn't see him, didn't hear him, didn't believe in him. What Rosemary didn't know was that her intuition was absolutely correct. But the truth behind Gabriel's condition was far darker than she could ever imagine. Meanwhile, Robert continued his routine of absence and denial. He arrived late, left early, and stayed updated on Gabriel only through the weekly reports Julia sent him. Reports that always said the same thing. Patient is stable. Maintaining medication protocol. Minor progress observed. Intensive treatment must continue. Julia visited the house regularly, always under the pretext of evaluating Gabriel, but her conversations with Robert rarely touched on the details of the treatment. Instead, they talked about the future, about plans, about how Robert needed to take care of himself too. She presented herself as a constant, reliable presence, amid the chaos of his life. You can't blame yourself for what happened with Marina, Julia would say, her professional tone giving way to a growing intimacy. Some people just aren't prepared for the challenges of motherhood, especially when a child with special needs is involved. Robert accepted this comfort, this narrative that absolved him of responsibility, that cast Marina as the villain and him as the victim. It was easier that way. Easier than facing his own absence, his own choice to distance himself from his son. But the truth has a peculiar way of emerging, even when buried, under layers of denial and convenience. It was on an April afternoon, a month after Rosemary began her secret interactions with Gabriel, that everything started to change. Rosemary was in the living room, arranging the sofa cushions, when she heard raised voices coming from the hallway. It was the psychologist who worked with Gabriel, Dr. Patricia, arguing on the phone. No, Julia, I'm telling you he's too sedated. I can't do any real work when he can barely keep his eyes open. What do you mean it's part of the protocol? Protocols can be adjusted. Look, you're the neurologist, but I'm the psychologist, and I'm telling you there's no way to assess any cognitive development like this. The conversation continued, but Rosemary couldn't hear more because Gabriel entered the room, staggering slightly, as he always did after his sessions. His eyes were particularly glazed over that day. Rosemary felt a wave of anger course through her. How many doses of those drugs were they giving that boy? That night, Rosemary made another risky decision. Before leaving, after the medical team had gone and Robert had not yet arrived, she went up to Gabriel's room and checked the nightstand where his medications were kept. There were 6 different bottles. Rosemary photographed all the labels with her old cell phone. Then she went to the kitchen, where there was a trash can with the day's medical waste. She found empty vials, medication packaging. She photographed everything. When she got home that night to her small studio apartment in the South Bronx, Rosemary spent hours researching each of those medications online. What she discovered horrified her. 3 of the drugs were strong sedatives, normally used in extreme cases of agitation. 2 were heavy antipsychotics, and one of them, according to the medical websites, she could access was an experimental drug, still in the testing phase. with side effects that included extreme lethargy, mental confusion, and regression of cognitive skills. Rosemary didn't sleep that night. She knew she was facing something terribly wrong, but she didn't know what to do. If she told the father, it would be her word, the word of a cleaning lady with no current qualifications, against that of a renowned neurologist. She would be fired and probably never find a job again. If she went to the authorities, she likely wouldn't even be taken seriously. But one thing Rosemary decided for sure: she needed to document everything. She needed to prove that Gabriel was capable, that he wasn't the apathetic being everyone saw during the sessions. And so, in the following days, Rosemary began to record short videos on her cell phone, always in stolen moments when she was alone with Gabriel. Videos of Gabriel singing, of Gabriel pointing to objects, of Gabriel solving small puzzles she brought hidden in her purse, of Gabriel counting to 10 in his soft, hesitant voice. Each video was proof. Each interaction was evidence that there was a brilliant boy trapped inside a sedated body, inside a system that kept him silenced. Rosemary didn't know it yet, but those videos would become the key to unlocking the whole truth. And the truth, when it finally came to light, would shake not only the Miller family, but an entire network of carefully constructed lies. Meanwhile, Robert remained oblivious to it all, living in the comfortable bubble Julia had created for him, believing he was doing the best for Gabriel by keeping him in that expensive and supposedly advanced treatment. He didn't know that his absence was costing his son much more than just time. It was costing him his voice, his identity, his chance to be seen as he truly was. But things were about to change, because in every story of silence there comes a moment when the truth can no longer be contained. And when that happens, the noise is deafening. Fate, with its characteristic irony, would choose a stormy night to bring father and son face to face, without intermediaries, without doctors, without protocols. A night that would change everything. And Rosemary, the invisible woman whom no one noticed, was about to become the most important piece in this whole complex story of discovery and redemption. The storm arrived without warning on a Wednesday night in May. Robert was in Washington, D.C., in a meeting that had stretched over 3 days, negotiating a government contract that could triple his company's revenue. Julia had sent messages during the day, saying she would stop by the house to check on Gabriel after his therapies, as she always did. But Robert's flight was cancelled due to the weather conditions in the capital. All subsequent flights were also suspended. Frustrated, he decided to rent a car and drive back to New York, a nearly 10-hour journey that would get him home around midnight. As he drove down the dark highway, under the rain that hammered against the windshield, Robert found himself thinking about Gabriel in a way he hadn't in a long time. When was the last time he had truly spoken to his son? When was the last time he had hugged him, looked into his eyes, tried to connect with him for real? Guilt, that old companion he kept locked away in a distant compartment of his mind, began to knock insistently. Marina had blamed him for many things before she left. She said he was married to his work, that he was never present, that she felt alone raising a child he barely knew. At the time, Robert had rejected those accusations, defending himself with arguments about financial responsibility and providing for the family. But now, 3 years later, driving alone in the storm, he could no longer escape the truth. He had repeated the same pattern. He worked incessantly, completely outsourced Gabriel's care, and kept himself at a safe distance from the pain and discomfort he felt when facing his son. It was almost 11:30 when Robert parked in the garage, at home. The rain had subsided to a fine drizzle. The house was quiet, with only a few lights on downstairs. Robert entered through the side door, leaving his suitcase in the hall. That's when he heard it, a child's voice, singing softly, coming from the living room. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are." Robert froze. That was Gabriel's voice. He would recognize it anywhere, even though he hadn't heard it in so long. But Gabriel didn't speak. He didn't sing. The report said he remained nonverbal, communicating only through basic gestures and guttural sounds. With his heart racing, Robert walked silently toward the living room. What he saw as he rounded the corner left him completely paralyzed. Gabriel was sitting on the rug, cross-legged, wearing blue pajamas with stars, and next to him, Also sitting on the floor was Rosemary, the cleaning lady. Between them, colourful cards were spread out, each with a number or a simple picture. "Very good, Gabriel. Now show me the number 5, Rosemary was saying, her voice full of encouragement and genuine affection. Gabriel, with deliberate and precise movements, picked up the correct card and handed it to Rosemary, smiling. A real smile, one that lit up his entire face. "That's right. You're so smart, my love. Now let's try with the colours. Which one is green?" Again, Gabriel pointed correctly, this time verbalizing, Green. Robert felt his legs weaken. He leaned against the doorframe, unable to process what he was witnessing. Was that his son? That alert, interactive, smiling boy who was pointing out colours and numbers with precision? It was Rosemary who noticed his presence first. She turned her head sharply, her face paling as she saw her employer standing in the doorway. She quickly began to gather the cards, standing up with nervous movements. "Mr. Miller, I didn't know you were coming back today. I was just—" But Robert wasn't paying attention to her. His eyes were fixed on Gabriel, who was now looking at him too. For a brief moment, father and son stared at each other, and Robert saw something in the boy's eyes he hadn't seen since he was very small. Recognition. Connection. "Daddy," Gabriel said, hesitant, as if testing the word on his tongue. Robert felt tears burn his eyes. When was the last time Gabriel had called him that? Years. Years had passed. He approached slowly, kneeling on the rug at Gabriel's level. "Hi, son," his voice came out choked. You're playing with Rosemary?" Gabriel nodded, picking up one of the cards and showing it to Robert. Number 8. "Yes, that's the number 8, Robert confirmed, his hand trembling as he touched the card. "You know how to count?" 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, Gabriel began, his voice gaining confidence. He reached 10 without a mistake, and Robert felt as if he were witnessing a miracle. Rosemary remained standing, torn between the urge to run and the need to explain what was happening. Robert finally turned his attention to her. "Please sit down," he said, his tone not accusatory, but genuinely confused. "I need to understand what's going on here." Rosemary sat back down, her nervous hands clasped in her lap. "Mr. Miller, I know I'm not authorized to do this. I know I'm going to be fired, and I accept that. But I had to. I couldn't just—" "How long have you been doing this?" Robert interrupted. "A month and a half," Rosemary admitted, her voice low. "I started noticing that Gabriel reacted to things. When he was alone, when none of the medical team was around. He would watch colors, pay attention to sounds, try to imitate words I sang." "And you didn't tell anyone?" Rosemary took a deep breath. "Sir, with all due respect, I'm a cleaning lady. If I had said something, who would have believed me? Against a famous neurologist, against an entire team of specialists. They would have said I was making things up, that I was overstepping my bounds, that I was putting the child at risk. They would have fired me on the spot and probably done something. Worse." Robert couldn't disagree. He himself wouldn't have taken Rosemary's words seriously against Julia's credentials. The realization hit him like a punch. He had trusted so much in medical authority, in professional status, in the diplomas on the walls, that he had forgotten to trust his own eyes. "Show me what he can do," Robert requested, his voice firm but gentle. For the next 40 minutes, Robert watched in amazement as Rosemary worked with Gabriel. The boy identified all the colors, counted to 20, made simple cause and effect associations, and demonstrated an understanding of basic commands. He communicated with single words and short phrases at his own pace, but he communicated. He was present, engaged, alive in a way Robert had never seen him during any medical session. "Rosemary," Robert said when they took a break while Gabriel drank some water. "Why doesn't he do this during his therapies? Why does he seem absent with the professionals?" Rosemary bit her lip, clearly hesitant. Finally, she decided to be honest. "Mr. Miller, I don't know if I should say this, but the medication. He gets a lot of medication. When he wakes up in the morning before the sessions, he can barely keep his eyes open. It's only in the afternoon, when the effect wears off a bit, that he becomes more alert. And even then—" She paused, as if deciding how far she could go. "And even then, what?" Robert pressed. And even then, he's learned to shut down. I noticed it in the first few weeks. When the therapists arrive, he automatically switches off, like it's a protection. But when he's with me, when he knows he won't be forced, that he won't have those tests, all those evaluations, he relaxes. He shows up. Robert ran a hand through his hair, a growing anguish tightening in his chest. What medications is he taking, do you know? Rosemary hesitated again. Sir, I took pictures of the bottles. I looked them up online. There are a lot, and they're very strong. Sedatives, antipsychotics. There's one that shouldn't even be used on children yet. It's in a trial phase. You have these pictures? Robert asked, his voice now tense. Rosemary took out her old cell phone and showed him the images. Robert zoomed in on each photo, reading the names of the drugs, the dosages. His medical knowledge was zero, but even, he could see that it seemed excessive for a 5-year-old child. Rosemary, do you have more evidence that Gabriel can do these things? I have videos, she admitted. I know it was wrong, but I needed to document it. I needed to have proof that he's capable, in case someone tried to, I don't know, say I was making it up. Robert asked to see the videos. One by one, he watched Gabriel singing, counting, answering questions, assembling simple puzzles. In all of them, the boy was alert, happy, engaged. It was a brutal contrast to the lethargic, absent Gabriel he saw in the rare moments he was home during the sessions. Why did you do this? Robert asked, looking at Rosemary with an expression between gratitude and confusion. Why did you risk so much? Rosemary's eyes filled with tears. Because I was a teacher for many years, sir. I taught hundreds of children, and one of the worst things that can happen to a child is to be underestimated, to have their abilities denied, to be locked into a diagnosis as if it were a final sentence. When I look at Gabriel, I see a brilliant child who is being silenced, and I couldn't stay silent either. Robert felt a lump in his throat. This woman whom he barely noticed, who earned a minimum wage to clean his house, had seen and done for his son what he himself had failed to do. She had risked her job, her reputation, out of pure compassion and conviction. Rosemary, you are not going to be fired, Robert said firmly. Quite the opposite. You may have saved my son. That night, after Rosemary left with the promise that they would talk more the next day, Robert stayed awake, Gabriel sleeping in his lap for the first time in years. He watched his son breathing softly, his face peaceful in sleep, and felt a mixture of emotions he could barely process. There was anger at himself for being so absent, so negligent, anger for having blindly trusted professionals without ever questioning, anger for having lost precious years of Gabriel's life. There was guilt, the crushing guilt of having failed as a father, of having left his son at the mercy of a system that clearly wasn't working. But there was also something else, determination. Robert was a businessman accustomed to solving complex problems, to unraveling corporate conspiracies, to fighting when necessary. And now, for the first time in 3 years, he had a clear purpose, to find out what was really happening with Gabriel's treatment, and, if necessary, destroy anything that was harming his son. The next morning, Robert cancelled all his meetings for the week. He called his company, saying he had a family emergency. For the first time in 3 years, Gabriel would be his absolute priority. The first thing he did was observe the morning routine. He was present when the nurse arrived with a tray of medications. He had different bottles, syringes, vials. Robert watched as she prepared the doses with mechanical efficiency. How many medications does he take a day? Robert asked, trying to keep his tone casual. As per Dr. Foster's protocol, sir. 3 doses in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, 1 at night. And is that normal for a child with autism? The nurse seemed uncomfortable with the question. I just follow the prescriptions, Mr. Miller. The doctor determines the protocol. After the nurse administered the medications, Robert watched Gabriel gradually become drowsy, his movements slowing, his eyes losing the sparkle he had seen the night before. Within 20 minutes, the boy was practically asleep in his chair. When the first therapist arrived, a speech therapist named Carla, Gabriel could barely hold his head up. Nevertheless, the session proceeded, with the professional trying to stimulate verbal responses from a child who was clearly too sedated to respond to anything. Robert watched it all from the doorway, his jaw clenched with tension. How could this be considered therapy? How could no one question the fact that the child was being treated while practically unconscious? After the session, Robert called Carla for a private conversation in his office. "Be honest with me," he said, closing the door. "How do you assess Gabriel's progress?" Carla seemed surprised by the question. "Mr. Miller, this should be discussed with Dr. Foster. She coordinates the entire treatment. I'm asking for your professional opinion. You're a speech therapist. You've been working with him for almost 2 years. Do you think he's progressing?" The woman hesitated, clearly torn between professional loyalty and honesty. "Sir, Gabriel is a complex case, severe autism, often. Is he too sedated to respond to your work?" Robert cut in, getting straight to the point. Carla opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Finally, she sighed. "Yes. For months I've been telling Dr. Foster that he needs to be more alert for me to work properly. But she insists the medication is necessary to control disruptive behaviors, even though I've told her I rarely see those behaviors. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because it's not my place to question the lead neurologist, and because, well, frankly, sir, you were never here. You never attended the team meetings, never asked about the sessions. All reports went directly to Dr. Foster. The truth hurt, but Robert needed to hear it. He himself had created a system where Julia had total control, where no one would question him because he never questioned anything himself. "From now on, I will be present for every session," Robert declared, "and I want honest, unfiltered reports. If you think something isn't working, I want to know." Carla nodded, relieved to finally have permission to be honest. The same pattern repeated with the other therapists. The psychologist, Dr. Patricia, admitted that for months she had been trying to get access to Gabriel without the interference of sedatives, but her requests were always denied. The occupational therapist confessed that he was essentially working with a child who slept more than he interacted. Each conversation added another layer of anger and indignation in Robert's chest. How had he let this happen? How had he not noticed? In the afternoon, as the effects of the medication began to wear off, Robert cancelled the remaining sessions and stayed alone with Gabriel. With the help of Rosemary, whom he had asked to stay beyond her usual hours, he tried to recreate the activities from the previous night. At first, Gabriel was hesitant, as if unsure whether he could trust that his father wouldn't disappear again. But gradually, with patience and encouragement from Rosemary, he began to open up. He showed Robert the colors, the numbers, sang songs with his still uncertain but clear voice. Robert cried openly when Gabriel, for the first time in years, climbed into his lap and rested his head on his chest, murmuring, "Daddy, stay." "Daddy stays," Robert promised, holding his son tight. "Daddy's not going anywhere anymore." That afternoon, while Gabriel napped in his lap, Robert made the decisions that would change everything. First, he needed independent medical opinions. Second, he needed to understand exactly what Julia was doing and why. And third, he needed to be prepared for the possibility that his suspicions would be confirmed, that the woman he had trusted, with whom he had become involved, might be deliberately harming his son. The question that tormented him was why. If Julia was really keeping Gabriel purposely sedated, what would be the reason? What would be the benefit for her? He didn't know it yet, but he was about to discover that the truth was even darker than he imagined, and that Julia wasn't just negligent or misguided in her treatment. She was part of something much bigger, much more calculated, much more dangerous. For now, Robert just held his son, feeling the small weight in his arms, listening to the soft breathing, and making a silent promise. No matter what it cost, no matter who he had to fight, he would protect Gabriel. He would be the father he should have been from the start, and Rosemary, the invisible woman who had become visible exactly when it mattered most, would be his most important ally on this journey, because she had seen Gabriel when no one else did. And now, finally, Robert was learning to see too. Robert spent the next 3 days immersed in an investigation that grew more complex by the hour. He hired 2 independent pediatric neurologists from other cities to evaluate Gabriel, ensuring they had no connection to Julia Foster. Both reached the same alarming conclusions. Dr. Edward Martin from Chicago was the first to examine Gabriel on an afternoon when the usual medications were accidentally forgotten. He spent 4 hours interacting with the boy, applying cognitive tests, observing behavioral patterns, and analyzing his medical history. "Mr. Miller," Dr. Martin said, his expression serious as he reviewed his notes in Robert's office, "I need to be direct with you. Your son does not present with severe level 3 autism, as stated in the diagnosis. From what I've observed, we're looking at a level 1, possibly even borderline. Gabriel has excellent cognitive abilities, language development appropriate for a child who has been understimulated, and a capacity for social interaction that, in the right environment, could fully flourish." Robert felt relief and rage at the same time. "And the medications?" The doctor shook his head in disapproval. "Excessive. Dangerously excessive. Especially this one." He pointed to one of the vials. "This is an experimental drug, not yet approved by the FDA for use in children. Its effects include cognitive suppression, extreme lethargy, and ironically, it can induce symptoms that mimic severe autism in children who don't naturally have them." "Are you telling me the drugs are making my son appear more autistic than he really is?" "Exactly. It's as if they're artificially creating the symptoms they're supposed to be treating, and there's more. The dosage is far above what would be considered safe, even if the drug were approved." The second opinion, from Dr. Helen Carter of Boston, confirmed everything. She was even more emphatic, suggesting that Robert report the case to the proper medical authorities. Armed with these reports, Robert knew the next step was to confront Julia. But first, he needed to understand the full extent of the situation. He began to review all the documents related to Gabriel's treatment from the past 2 years. That's when he discovered something disturbing. In the financial records, Robert found payments he didn't recognize. Monthly transfers to a company called Neurotech Research, described as a contribution to clinical research. The amounts were substantial, $50,000 a month, totaling over $1 million over 2 years. Robert had never authorized these transfers. He checked the signatures on the documents, and although they were digital and technically valid, he didn't remember signing anything related to clinical research. He suspected Julia had included this authorization amidst other documents he had signed without reading carefully, blindly trusting her. A quick internet search revealed that Neurotech Research was a pharmaceutical research company focused on neurological drugs. And guess who was listed as one of its scientific directors? Julia Foster. The puzzle was beginning to form. Julia wasn't just treating Gabriel inadequately out of negligence. She was using the boy as a test subject for experimental research, billing Robert for it, and likely producing manipulated data for publications and patents. The discovery made Robert physically ill. He ran to the bathroom and vomited, the betrayal hitting him in waves. Julia, the woman he had trusted, with whom he had become emotionally involved, was using his son as an experiment. It was Rosemary who found Robert sitting on the bathroom floor, pale and trembling. "Mr. Miller, what happened?" In a choked voice, Robert told her everything. Rosemary sat beside him, her silent presence all the comfort she could offer. "We're going to fix this," she said finally, her voice firm. "We're going to protect Gabriel, and we're going to get justice." But getting justice wouldn't be as simple as Robert imagined. Things were about to get much more complicated. 2 days later, while Robert was still gathering all the evidence and consulting with lawyers about the next steps, Rosemary arrived at the house, visibly shaken. "Mr. Miller, I need to talk to you urgently," she said, her hands trembling as she held her phone. She showed Robert an article published on a city gossip blog. The headline made his blood run cold. "Millionaire CEO exposes autistic son to unauthorized treatment with unqualified employee." The article painted a distorted picture of the situation. It claimed that Robert, in his parental negligence, had allowed a cleaning lady with no valid professional license and an unknown past to have unrestricted access to Gabriel, subjecting him to unscientific methods and placing the child at risk. There were even photos of the house taken from outside and a blurry image of Rosemary entering through the side door. "How did they get this information?" Robert asked, furious. "There's only one way," Rosemary answered, her voice trembling. Someone from inside the house is leaking information, and I think I know who. In the following days, more articles appeared. Tabloid blogs, gossip columns, and even some social media pages began to share the story with increasingly accusatory tones against Rosemary. Her past was exposed: the divorce, the years of unemployment, the loss of her teaching license for not renewing her qualifications. The worst came when Rosemary received a legal notice. Someone had filed a complaint against her for unlawful practice of a regulated profession and child endangerment. The lawsuit was filed by an organization she had never heard of, the Institute for the Protection of Neurodivergent Children. Robert investigated. The institute was a front, created just 6 months ago, with its address registered at a virtual office. And guess who was listed as a technical consultant? Julia Foster. "She's trying to silence you," Robert said to Rosemary, his jaw tight with anger. "She's using the system against you to intimidate you, to make you back down." "It's going to work," Rosemary said quietly, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Miller, I don't have money for a lawyer. I can't fight this. If this goes to court, I'll lose everything. I could even go to jail." "You're not going anywhere," Robert declared. "I'm getting you the best lawyers in the country. And what's more, we're going to use this against her." Julia just showed her hand. Now we know she's willing to destroy people to protect her interests. But the situation was about to escalate in ways neither of them imagined. The following night, Robert had an unexpected visitor. Julia appeared at the door, impeccably dressed as always, her face a mask of professional concern. "Robert, we need to talk," she said, walking in, without waiting for an invitation. They sat in the living room, the same one where Robert had discovered Gabriel interacting with Rosemary. The tension in the air was palpable. "I'm worried about you," Julia began, her tone measured. "These sudden decisions to stop Gabriel's treatment, to bring in these outside doctors without consulting me. Robert, I understand you're confused, but you need to trust the process. Gabriel has been under my care for years. I know what's best for him." "Do you?" Robert retorted, his voice icy. "Because the independent doctors who examined my son came to very different conclusions than yours. They think Gabriel is being over-medicated, that he doesn't have severe autism, that the drugs are worsening his condition instead of improving it." Julia sighed, as if dealing with a stubborn child. "Robert, that's exactly what I feared. Doctors who don't know the full case history, who see Gabriel just once on a good day and make rash judgments. Trust me, I've been studying this field for 20 years. I know severe autism when I see it." "Or maybe you know how to create it," Robert said, letting the accusation hang in the air. Julia's face changed subtly, the mask of professional concern giving way to something colder. "What are you implying?" "Neurotech research, $50,000 a month, experimental drugs. Gabriel isn't your patient, Julia. He's your guinea pig." There was a moment of heavy silence. Julia leaned back in the armchair, assessing Robert with new eyes. When she spoke again, her voice had lost all pretense of warmth. "I see you've been doing some digging. You must be proud of yourself." The great businessman finally paying attention to his son. Her tone was sharp. "But let me clarify a few things, Robert. Yes, Gabriel is part of a clinical study. A perfectly legal study approved by ethics committees, which, by the way, you authorized when you signed the treatment documents. You were so busy, so absent, you didn't even bother to read what you were signing. You deceived me. I gave you an opportunity. Parents like you who feel guilty for their own negligence are perfect. You'll sign anything if we promise to fix your children. And Gabriel is giving us valuable data on how new drugs affect neural development in children on the spectrum." Robert felt nauseous again. "You're admitting this? You're admitting you used my son for experiments?" "I'm stating facts. And here's another fact for you. If you try to expose me, you will regret it. That employee of yours, Rosemary, she's facing serious charges. It could easily turn into a more severe case. Unlawful practice of medicine, child endangerment. There are very creative lawyers out there. Are you threatening me?" Julia stood up, smoothing her skirt. "I'm offering you a way out. You continue the treatment, get rid of that woman, and we all go on with our lives. Gabriel will receive the proper medical care. You won't have your name dragged." Threw the mud in the media, and no one needs to know about any of this. Think about it, Robert. Which headline do you prefer? Negligent father exposes son to irregular treatment, or successful CEO cares for special needs son with the best resources? Get out of my house, Robert said, his voice low but filled with restrained fury. You have 48 hours to decide, Julia said, walking toward the door. She turned one last time. And Robert, everything you've built, your reputation, your company, your public image, it can all come crashing down very quickly when the press starts. Asking the right questions, think about it. After she left, Robert stood in the living room trembling with anger and fear. Julia wasn't bluffing. She had resources, connections, the ability to manipulate narratives. She could truly destroy his life, Rosemary's life, and worst of all, she could use Gabriel as an emotional hostage in this power game. It was in this moment of desperation that Robert received an unexpected message, an unknown number. My name is Laura. I was a patient of Dr. Foster's when I was 14. I need to talk to you, please. Robert replied immediately, arranging a meeting for the next day at a discreet cafe in Greenwich Village. Laura was now 17, a slim teenager with purple hair and eyes that held a maturity beyond her years. She sat across from Robert, nervous but determined. I saw the news about Rosemary, she began, and I recognized the doctor's name. I had to warn you before it's too late. What Laura recounted over the next 2 hours was devastating. At 14, after an episode of severe anxiety at school, her parents took her to Julia. The diagnosis was swift, bipolar disorder requiring urgent medication. But I wasn't bipolar, Laura explained. I was going through a tough time like any teenager. I had just changed schools, I was having trouble fitting in, but the doctor put me on a cocktail of drugs that turned me into a zombie. I slept 16 hours a day, couldn't think straight, couldn't feel anything. And your parents? Robert asked. My mum was very sick at the time. My dad worked a lot. He trusted the doctor completely, just like you did. And the more I complained about the drugs, the more she increased the doses, saying I was resisting treatment. How did you get out of that situation? Laura smiled bitterly. My literature teacher. She noticed something was wrong, that I wasn't the same girl. She talked to my dad, insisted he get a second opinion. When they did, they found out I was being needlessly over-medicated. It took them 6 months to safely wean me off all those drugs. And Julia? She tried to do the same thing she's doing now. Smeared my teacher's reputation. Tried to sue my parents for stopping treatment without medical authorization, spread rumors. But my dad has connections in the media. He managed to quash it. We signed a non-disclosure agreement and she left us alone. Robert felt a flicker of hope. You signed an NDA? My dad did. But I was a minor at the time, and now I'm a legal adult. I can say whatever I want. Laura leaned forward. Mr. Miller, I'm not the only one. There are other families. The doctor does this systematically. She picks children from wealthy families with busy parents, makes exaggerated diagnoses, puts them on experimental treatments, charges a fortune, and produces data for her research. And when someone questions her, she destroys them. Would you testify? Officially? Yes. And I can put you in touch with 2 other families who went through the same thing. They didn't sign NDAs. They were just too scared to come forward. But if someone takes the first step, if someone is brave enough to face her publicly, they will back them up. For the first time, Robert felt he wasn't alone in this fight. There were other victims, other families Julia had manipulated and used, and together they could be strong enough to bring her down. Laura, you may have saved my son, Robert said, his voice emotional. No, sir, the person who saved your son was that employee, Rosemary. She saw what all of us should have seen, that the children are being silenced, not helped. I'm doing this for all the kids who didn't have a Rosemary to stand up for them. That night, Robert gathered Rosemary and his lawyers and began to assemble a plan. They would go public with everything: the independent medical reports, the financial documents showing the payments to the research company, the testimony from Laura and the other families, the videos of Gabriel progressing under Rosemary's care. But there was a huge risk. Julia had made it clear she would retaliate. The media could turn against them. Robert could lose everything he had built. "I'm scared," Robert admitted to Rosemary that night as Gabriel slept in the room next door. "Me too," Rosemary confessed. "But you know what scares me more? The thought of Gabriel growing up not knowing that someone fought for him, that someone believed in him when no one else did. He deserves this fight, Mr. Miller, and we deserve the chance to do the right thing." Robert looked at the woman before him, this unemployed teacher, this cleaning lady who had revealed herself to be more courageous and principled than any credentialed professional he knew. "You're right," he said finally. "We're doing this. We'll bring the truth to light, whatever the cost." What neither of them knew was that Julia was already making her move, preparing her own counterattack, and that things were about to get much more dangerous before they got better. But Robert had made his decision. For the first time in 3 years, he would choose his son above all else. Above his company, above his reputation, above his comfort. Gabriel would be protected. Rosemary would be defended. And Julia would face the consequences of her actions. The war was just beginning, but now, finally, Robert was ready to fight. The press conference was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in the ballroom of a hotel in Midtown Manhattan. Robert had hired a crisis communications firm, gathered all the documents and coordinated the testimonies. Laura and 2 other families who had been victims of Julia agreed to participate. The independent medical reports were ready. The videos of Gabriel were edited and prepared for screening. But the night before the conference, Julia made her final move. Robert was at home, reviewing his speech for the 10th time, when he heard a noise from the side entrance. It was almost 11 at night. Rosemary had been staying in one of the guest rooms since the threats began, and Gabriel was asleep upstairs. Coming down the stairs silently, Robert saw Julia entering through the side door that led to the laundry room. She had a key. Of course she did. He had given it to her himself months ago, when their relationship seemed promising, when he trusted her completely. "Julia, what are you doing here?" Robert asked, keeping his distance. She turned, and he almost didn't recognize her. Her hair was down and disheveled, her makeup smeared, her clothes rumpled. This was a woman on the edge, without the mask of control she always wore. "You can't do this, Robert," she said, her voice wavering between a plea and a threat. "If you expose me tomorrow, you'll drag your own name through the mud. You'll expose Gabriel. Everyone will know you were an absent father, that you neglected your son. Your company will suffer. Your investors will question your judgment. You'll lose everything." "I've already lost the most important things," Robert answered calmly. "I lost years with my son. I almost lost him completely because of my negligence and your manipulation. I have nothing left to lose." "Yes, you do," Julia advanced, her voice rising. "Your reputation, your future, the company you built. And her too," she pointed upstairs where Rosemary was staying. "That woman is going to be dragged through the courts. I will personally make sure she never works again, that she's investigated, that—" "Stop!" The voice came from upstairs. They all looked toward the staircase. Gabriel was standing at the top of the steps, in his pajamas, clutching his teddy bear. But this was not the apathetic, distant Gabriel that Julia knew. His eyes were alert, focused, and there was a determination in them that even Robert had never seen. "Gabriel, son, go back to bed," Robert said gently. But Gabriel started down the stairs, step by step, holding the railing. When he reached the hall, he walked directly between Robert and Julia, turning to face the doctor. You make me sleep," Gabriel said, his voice clear despite the effort. "You give shots. I don't like it. I'm scared." Julia turned pale. "Gabriel, sweetie, I was just helping you." "No." Gabriel shook his head vehemently. "You don't help. Rosemary helps. Rosemary sings. Rosemary teaches. With you, I just sleep and I'm sad." Robert felt tears burn his eyes. His son, who supposedly could barely form sentences, was expressing himself with emotional clarity and truth. Rosemary appeared at the top of the stairs, wearing a robe, clearly awakened by the noise. She started to come down, but Gabriel held up a hand, asking her to wait. He still had something to say. "I want to learn, want to play, want to talk. I don't want to sleep all day anymore," Gabriel continued, now looking at his father. "Daddy stay with me? Daddy won't let her make me sleep anymore?" Robert knelt to his son's level, hugging him tightly. "Daddy stays, Gabriel. Daddy won't let anyone hurt you ever again, I promise." Julia watched the scene, her expression shifting from desperation to something darker. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said, her voice now cold and calculating. "I've built an entire career. I've published papers, developed protocols, I have patents pending. I will not let a spoiled child and a pretentious housekeeper destroy everything." It was then that Rosemary descended the last few steps and stood beside Gabriel, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "We're not trying to destroy your career, Dr. Foster," Rosemary said calmly. "We're trying to save this child and all the others you've harmed. If your career was built on lies and the suffering of children, then it deserves to be destroyed." "You, a simple cleaning lady, dare to judge me?" Julia spat the words. "You have no qualifications, no formal education. You have nothing. Why would anyone believe you over me?" "Because I saw," Rosemary replied, her voice remaining calm. "I saw what you refused to see. I saw a child who needed love, patience, someone to believe in him. And I saw a doctor who was more interested in her own ambitions than in the well-being of her patients." "Julia," Robert intervened, "you need to leave now. I'm giving you one last chance. Tomorrow you can show up at the conference and take responsibility for your actions. You can apologize to the families, return the money, cooperate with the investigations, or you can run and face the legal consequences that will come either way." Julia laughed, a humorless sound. "You really think you can take me down? I have excellent lawyers, influential friends, years of an impeccable reputation. This press conference tomorrow is going to be a disaster. I'll make sure of it personally." "Then we'll see you tomorrow," Robert said firmly. "Security!" 2 security guards Robert had hired in recent days appeared, escorting Julia out. She left shouting threats, but Robert was unshaken. He had his son in his arms, he had Rosemary by his side, and he had the truth as his weapon. That night, Gabriel slept between Robert and Rosemary on the living room sofa, watching cartoons late, eating popcorn, laughing at silly jokes. It was the most normal, most perfect night Robert had ever lived as a father, and he promised himself there would be many more like it. The morning of the press conference dawned with a clear sky over New York. The ballroom was packed with journalists from major outlets, bloggers, representatives from autism advocacy organizations, and families curious about the case that had leaked on social media in recent days. Robert took the stage wearing a simple suit, no tie, looking more human than CEO. Rosemary sat in the front row next to Laura and the other families who would testify. Gabriel had stayed home with a trusted babysitter, but his videos would be shown. "Good morning, everyone," Robert began, his voice firm but filled with emotion. "My name is Robert Miller, and I'm here today to tell a story about failure, manipulation, and finally redemption." For the next 40 minutes, Robert detailed everything. He spoke of his absence as a father, of how he had completely outsourced Gabriel's care, of how he had blindly trusted Julia Foster without ever questioning her methods. He showed the financial documents proving the payments to the research company, the independent medical reports contradicting the original diagnosis, the excessive prescriptions for experimental drugs. When the videos of Gabriel were shown, the silence in the room was absolute. Everyone watched the boy counting, singing, interacting with Rosemary, demonstrating skills that completely contradicted the diagnosis of severe autism Julia had given. Then it was Laura's turn. The teenager took the stage with a courage that was stunning for her age and told her story. Then came the other 2 families, each reporting similar experiences: over-medicated children, exaggerated diagnoses, exorbitant fees, and intimidation when they questioned the methods. "Dr. Julia Foster is a predator," one of the mothers declared, her voice trembling with anger and pain. "She targets vulnerable families, parents desperate for help, and uses our children as guinea pigs for her research. She is not a doctor. She is a criminal in a white coat." The fallout was immediate and massive. Before the conference even ended, the hashtag #JusticeForGabriel was trending on Twitter. Advocacy groups for the rights of neurodivergent children issued statements of support. The state medical board announced the opening of an ethics investigation against Julia. But the most impactful development came in the afternoon when the U.S. Attorney's Office announced that an investigation into neurotech research and Julia Foster had already been underway for 6 months, prompted by anonymous tips. Robert's press conference had provided the public evidence needed to turn the investigation into formal legal action. Julia tried to defend herself through her publicist, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that the treatments were approved, and that the families had consented. But the more she spoke, the worse her situation became. More families began to come forward. More former employees started to testify about unethical practices. More documents were leaked. 3 days after the conference, Julia's medical license was preventively suspended. Her bank accounts were frozen. Neurotech research had its operations halted, and civil lawsuits and official investigations began to pile up. It was at a preliminary hearing 2 weeks later that the most dramatic moment of the entire story occurred. Robert had brought Gabriel, accompanied by Rosemary, to testify about his experiences. The judge, moved by the case, allowed the child to speak directly with the support of a forensic psychologist. Gabriel, wearing a blue shirt and jeans, sat in the special chair adapted for children. Julia was on the other side of the room with her lawyers, her face a mask of contained rage. The judge, a middle-aged man with a kind expression, addressed Gabriel. "Gabriel, do you know why you're here today?" "Yes, sir," Gabriel replied, his voice soft but clear. "To tell the truth. And do you promise to tell only the truth?" "I promise." "Very good. Gabriel, can you tell me how you felt when Dr. Foster was taking care of you?" Gabriel looked at Julia, and for the first time she seemed genuinely shaken. The child's eyes showed no anger, but something more powerful: disappointment. "I felt scared," Gabriel said. "Scared of the shots, scared of sleeping and not waking up, scared of being stuck in the sleep forever." "Stuck in the sleep? Can you explain that?" "When she gave me the medicine, I got very tired. I couldn't think right. I couldn't talk even when I wanted to. It was like I was inside, screaming, but nobody could hear." A shocked murmur went through the room. Julia looked down, unable to meet the child's gaze. "And how do you feel now, without those medicines?" Gabriel's face lit up. "I feel awake. I get to learn new things every day with Rosemary. I get to talk to my dad. I even get to make friends at my new school. It's like I woke up from a nightmare for real." "Gabriel, is there anything you want to say to Dr. Foster?" Gabriel thought for a moment, then looked directly at her. "Why did you do that to me? I never did anything bad to you. I just wanted to learn. I just wanted to be happy. Why did you make me sleep for so long?" Julia opened her mouth, closed it, tried to speak, but no. Sound came out. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of genuine remorse. They were the tears of someone who had finally realized she had lost everything. The judge ended the testimony, visibly moved. In the hallways, journalists tried to speak to Robert and Rosemary, but they left quickly, shielding Gabriel from the chaos. In the months that followed, the Miller family's life was completely transformed. Julia permanently lost her medical license after the investigations confirmed all the accusations. Neurotech research was shut down, its directors facing prosecution. Several other children were identified as victims of the scheme and began proper treatment. Julia faced multiple civil and criminal proceedings, spending years defending herself in court. Robert sold a majority stake in his company, keeping only a consulting position that allowed him to work from home. His #1 priority was Gabriel, and he never neglected that again. Every morning he was the one who made breakfast, who took Gabriel to school, who attended parent-teacher conferences. Rosemary was formally hired as Gabriel's educational tutor, with a fair salary and full benefits. But more than that, she became part of the family. Robert paid for her to complete new certifications as a pedagogue specializing in inclusive education, and Rosemary flourished in this role. She not only worked with Gabriel, but began to help other children, sharing her approach based on patience, love, and belief in human potential. With Robert's financial resources and Rosemary's pedagogical expertise, they founded the Gabriel Institute, Education and Inclusion, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing accessible and respectful education for neurodivergent children from all social classes. The institute offered full scholarships to low-income families, training for educators, and advocacy for fairer public policies. Gabriel became the heart of the institution. At 7, he attended an inclusive school, had friends, took music lessons. It turned out he had a special talent for the piano and was a happy, vibrant, curious child. Yes, he was still on the autism spectrum. That was part of who he was, and no one tried to change it. But now he had the right support, unconditional love, and the freedom to simply be Gabriel. "Dad, look what I learned today." Gabriel ran into the living room a year after the press conference, holding a medal from an internal school math competition. Robert dropped his laptop and opened his arms, hugging his son. "I'm so proud of you, champ." Rosemary came in right behind him, smiling. "He solved problems that challenge even older children. Your son is special, Robert." "All children are special," Robert replied, "when we have the humility to truly see them." At night, the three of them had dinner together in the kitchen, as they did every evening now. Gabriel would talk about his day, his friends, what he learned, his plans for the science fair project. Robert listened to every word, participated in every conversation, was truly present. After Gabriel went to sleep, Robert and Rosemary sat on the terrace, drinking tea and watching the lights of New York City. "Have you ever thought about how different everything could have been?" Rosemary asked. "If that storm hadn't cancelled your flight, if you hadn't come home early that night?" Robert shook his head. "I think about it every day. I think about how many years I wasted, how much time I lost. But I also think about how lucky I am to have gotten a second chance. How many parents never find out the truth? How many children remain trapped in systems that don't see them? That's why the Institute is so important," Rosemary said. "So that no child remains invisible, so that no parent feels so lost that they accept anything without question. And so that every child has their own Rosemary," Robert added, looking at her with deep gratitude. "Someone who sees beyond the diagnosis, beyond the apparent limitations, someone who believes in the impossible." Rosemary smiled, blushing. "I just did what anyone with a heart would do." "No, Rosemary. Many people saw Gabriel every day and did nothing. You risked everything, your job, your safety, your freedom, for a child that wasn't even yours. That's not what anyone would do. That's heroism." A few weeks later, Laura, now 18 and studying psychology, began volunteering at the Institute. She said she wanted to give back, to help other kids who were going through what she went through. Her presence brought a valuable perspective from someone who had experienced firsthand what it was like to be misunderstood by the healthcare system. One afternoon, Laura was leading a support group for neurodivergent teens when Gabriel shyly entered the room. Can I join?" he asked. "I want to tell my story too." Laura smiled and made room for him. Gabriel sat in the circle and, with the growing eloquence he had developed over the past year, told his journey. He spoke of the dark days when he could barely keep his eyes open, of how he felt trapped inside his own body, of the fear he had of the doctor who was supposed to care for him. But he also spoke of Rosemary, of how she sang to him, of how she believed in him when no one else did. He spoke of his father, who made mistakes but had the courage to correct them. And he spoke of new beginnings, of second chances, of how no report defines who a person is or can be. When he finished, there were tears on many faces, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of hope, of recognition, of solidarity. "Gabriel," one of the teens in the group said, "you're so brave for sharing that. Thank you." "I'm not brave," Gabriel replied with his characteristic honesty. "I was just lucky to have people who fought for me, and now I want to fight for other kids too." The story of Gabriel and Rosemary gained national attention. Documentaries were made, books were written, and public policies began to be debated more seriously. The case exposed systemic flaws in the treatment of neurodivergent children, in the oversight of clinical research, and in the protection of vulnerable patients. But more important than all of that was what happened at home. In the small daily victories that no one filmed or documented, it was Robert helping Gabriel with his homework, the two of them laughing together at an inside joke. It was Rosemary teaching Gabriel how to bake, both of them covered in flour as they tried to make cookies. It was Gabriel playing the piano at a school recital, his father in the front row with tears of pride in his eyes. It was the family that was formed not by blood, but by choice, by love, by the determination to do the right thing, even when it was hard. Years later, at an event for the Institute, Robert was invited to give a speech. He took the stage, now a different man from the cold, absent CEO of years past. "When my ex-wife left," he began, "I thought my life was over. When Gabriel was diagnosed, I thought he would never have a full life. I was wrong on both counts. Life wasn't over. It just forced me to start again the right way." He looked at Rosemary, sitting in the front row next to Gabriel. "I learned that education doesn't just come from diplomas. I learned that love can come from where we least expect it. I learned that a woman considered just a cleaner by the world can have more wisdom and compassion than dozens of experts with impressive titles." Gabriel waved to his father, smiling. "But above all, I learned this. Children are not clinical cases. They are not statistics in research papers. They are not diagnoses on paper. They are whole human beings with infinite potential, just waiting for someone to have the patience, the love, and the courage to truly see them." The applause was deafening, but Robert wasn't speaking to the audience. He was speaking to his son, he was speaking to Rosemary. He was speaking to all the families still fighting in silence, searching for hope. That night, back at home, Robert tucked Gabriel into bed, as he did every night. "Dad," Gabriel said sleepily, "do you think Dr. Foster is okay?" The question surprised Robert. Even after everything Julia had done, Gabriel still had enough empathy to worry about her. "I don't know, son, but I hope that one day she understands what she did wrong and finds a way to make peace with herself." "I forgive her," Gabriel said simply. "Rosemary taught me that holding on to anger only hurts yourself. I'd rather hold on to the good things." Robert kissed his son's forehead, his heart overflowing with love and admiration. Gabriel, who had been silenced and medicated, was now teaching lessons on forgiveness and compassion. "You're amazing, you know that?" Robert whispered. "I know," Gabriel replied with a mischievous little smile. "Rosemary tells me that every day." After Gabriel fell asleep, Robert found Rosemary in the kitchen, preparing lunch for the next day. "Rosemary," he called. She turned, smiling. "Yes, Robert. Thank you for everything, for seeing my son when I was blind, for believing in him when I doubted, for fighting when I was ready to give up. You saved Gabriel, and you saved me too." Rosemary came closer and touched his arm gently. "No, Robert. You saved yourself when you finally decided to be present. I just turned on the light. You were the one who chose to walk out of the darkness. And there in that simple kitchen, on an ordinary Thursday night, was the real victory. Not in the headlines, not in the lawsuits won, not in the restored reputation. The real victory was in a child sleeping peacefully, free from nightmares and unnecessary medication. It was in a father who learned to love before it was too late. It was in a woman who proved that nobility of character is worth more than any academic title. It was in the certainty that when the silence is finally broken, when the truth is spoken with courage, when love triumphs over cold protocol and unbridled ambition, miracles happen. And Gabriel, the boy once considered a lost cause, who was silenced by drugs and neglect, now had a voice. And his voice echoed not just in his home, but in an entire movement of change, of compassion, of hope. The boy who was trapped had been set free, and in being freed, he also freed everyone around him, proving that no report, no diagnosis, no medical sentence can imprison the human spirit. When there is someone willing to believe, to fight, to love, unconditionally. This was the story of Gabriel, of Robert, of Rosemary. But it was also the story of all the invisible children, all the lost parents, all the ordinary people who make extraordinary choices. It was proof that silence can be broken, that darkness can be overcome by light, that it is never too late to start over, and that sometimes The greatest heroes don't wear white coats or carry diplomas. Sometimes they simply see what others refuse to see and have the courage to act when everyone else stays silent. This was the story of when the silence finally spoke, and oh, how much it had to say.